All right, gang, we're recording buyer series. Today is writing offers and handling negotiations. So excited to dig into this topic because especially in today's marketplace, working with buyers it just gets tougher and tougher, doesn't it? Trying to find the buyer a house, first of all, with the inventory the way that it is, and then trying to negotiate so that they can be successful if it's a popular property and you're dealing with multiple offers. So I want to look at each topic. I want to dive into, each segment of writing the offer, okay? And, of course, we want to start with all of the details that come into an offer. We'll discuss the nuances. And again, I want to make sure that we answer any questions that you have, throw them in the chat box. But, I want to discuss the offer itself. What is the process and what are the pieces of an offer, the sections of an offer that we need to be aware of. So, let's dig into the main focus details. Again, I'm watching the chat box, so bear with me if my eyes glance over. So first and foremost, the number one piece of an offer, of writing an offer, whether you're doing a letter of intent or a purchase and sales agreement, we'll talk about that, but depending on the format that you're using, is the price. Isn't it? When it comes to price, ultimately, you're representing the buyer. We always want to make sure that we stay within the confines of the client that we're representing. So for the purposes of our conversation. So you are representing the buyer. So we've got to look at that price and help the buyer understand what is the proper price for this property. And the first step in doing that is what? Somebody share with me. What's the first step in figuring out what the price is?
CMA.
What's that?
CMA.
CMA, yes. Determining the price is doing a market analysis, pulling up comps. Now, it may not be as formal of a market analysis that you would do with a seller, if you're doing a more of a presentation, if you will, like an interview. I mean, you're already working with the buyer. But ultimately, the buyer is relying on you to help them understand what that property is worth. And while today's market, appraisals are coming in higher than we expected, prices are coming in higher than we expected, there are variations involved with the whole thing. But at the end of the day, we've got to look at the comps and take a look at what are other homes selling for. Now, we had a session on in the seller series on doing a market analysis and what are we looking at, what are the details that come into play when pricing a property. So if you weren't here for that session, take a look back at that recording. But ultimately, you've got to take a look at the comps and understand what are similar homes going for and what would this home be worth based on those recent sales. There's no such thing as a true comparable. Every home is unique in its own way, but you still need to be aware of what is selling and for what amount, okay? So we need to understand where the seller is coming from in their pricing. And part of that is understanding what I'm making sure people are in. So bear with me, gang, because I just realized that I didn't take out the waiting room. I got a beep there. So, but what is the seller's position on the price? What is the seller considering in the asking price versus the value range of the house? So ultimately, you've got to determine based on, in doing that market analysis and looking at those comps, you've got to determine a value range for the property. Whenever we discuss value, because there's no one value for a property, every buyer will find a different value for every house based on how it meets their needs, won't they? Some buyers will find use for every feature in a home. Some buyers won't find use for every feature. The buyer who finds the most use for most features in a home is going to be the buyer that's willing to pay more for that property. If another buyer feels as though they need to remodel things or change things in the house, they might not be willing to pay that same amount. That is where we look at value range, because no one property has one specific value. Although appraisers come in with a set value based on formulas and calculations, in buyer's equity and emotions, it doesn't work that way. So we determine a value range for the property based on that, and you explain it as such to your buyer. This is the value range based on these recent sales and what's happening in the market. This is the value range. Now the buyer has to determine at what point in that range they want to be, don't they? Because it may have more or less features for their particular needs. So ultimately, they're going to determine. Now, you've got to help them with the strategy. When it comes to establishing the strategy for pricing, you've got to discuss with them, because at the end of the day, they own the outcome in any negotiation. If they make an offer that insults the seller, then they own that outcome if the seller doesn't make a counteroffer. If they make an offer that the seller accepts, we never want them wondering, should I have offered less? Many buyers regret, oh, did I offer too much? Should I have started lower? Well, ultimately, they need to be comfortable with that negotiation, and we've got to find a way to help them feel good in that scenario where an offer is accepted without any counteroffer. They should never question that. If they've truly looked at all the numbers and they understand where the value range is, and that seller accepted that value range, they should feel really good about it. Make sense? Okay, so you set a strategy for that negotiation. You set it up where ultimately they determine what price they'd like to start at, and then the seller will respond to that. Never should we as an agent advise a buyer what to offer, especially with all of the multiple offer scenarios that are out there. Should we suggest to a buyer what they should offer for that property? And if they don't get that house, if they lose it to a competing offer, who are they going to blame for losing that house? Us. That's how it's going to happen. So we cannot advise them, and we need to be able to speak to that with them and say, Mr. Buyer, this is your decision in making an offer. All I can do is lay out the facts, the numbers, take a look at the pricing strategy, give you an idea of the value range for the property. You have to determine what this home is worth to you, and ultimately determining a starting point. Now, they'll always say, well, Dean, what do you think? Well, it doesn't matter what I think, because I'm not buying the house. What matters is how you feel about this property and how you'd like to proceed. So they will sometimes grill you and say, yeah, but where would you start? Yes, but I thought that's why I hired you. Well, you didn't hire me to tell you what to do. You hired me to provide you the information that you need in order to make the best decision for yourself and your family. Now, okay, you can just come right out and say it. Listen, if I told you what to offer and your offer is not accepted, then it's my fault. I never want your purchase of your home to be dependent on my opinion. Let's talk through the details so that you feel comfortable with what your decision is. At the end of the day, if the seller accepts it, then we're going to feel good about it. If they reject it, then you can feel good knowing that you gave it your all. Makes sense? Any questions on pricing? Now we're going to go through the overall, but I just want to hit on each component of an offer. Any thoughts on pricing? Okay. Nobody's coming in the chat. All right, so we're going to go to the next. Closing date, right? You've got to understand this is another key component, okay? The closing date is important. We've got to be able to predict what amount of time we need. Now, let's be honest, the seller may need a certain amount of time in order to be able to close. The buyer may need a certain amount of time in order to be able to close. We need to understand the timelines that are involved. Primarily, what's affecting your closing time frame is the financing timelines, and we'll hit on that. But ultimately, ask the lender. Don't assume. There are too many practitioners out there right now that assume. They think, well, everything can close in 30 days, and we're just going to set it up for 30 days. It doesn't happen. Every lender is saying, please give me more time, especially right now with the way the market is, with the refi boom compared, in combination with the resale. So be mindful. Ask the loan officer. Listen, You cannot hold a loan officer accountable to a date that you set, but you can hold them accountable to a date that they gave you. So always ask them, and then allow some time, even if it's a week or so, in between loan approval and closing date. So the way to back into a closing date is to find out what the lender needs and allow that time. Unless there's somebody who needs something, more time, less time, and the bank says they will do their best, whatever that looks like. In today's market, you're looking at 45 to 60-day closings. Okay, because the lenders just need that extra time. They need that 5 to 6 week window for approval, unless it's a slam dunk. And what is that? What really is a slam dunk? Each program needs the amount of time to do the research and appraisal. One of the biggest things is the appraisal, the time to get the appraisal in there, get the report back, and to have the underwriter review it. So, those are important details there. So you can back into that. That also allows for everyone not to be running in circles in order to accomplish a short time frame. We've got to do inspections. We've got 10 business days to do inspections. That's up to 2 weeks right there. You try and close within 30 days and everything's just going to be too tight. Okay. And also, when you're setting a date, make sure that you at least look at a calendar. If a lender says to you 45 days is good, don't just add 45 days. Look at a calendar. I'm amazed at how many times we see a closing date or a financing date come in and that date is on a weekend. There is no way you're going to close on a weekend. Okay? I've seen it happen, but it's very rare. So make sure if you're going to hold dates accountable that you have their actual business work days. Make sense? Okay. Questions on closing date? Okay, so far so good. All right, so moving along, again, financing. We talked about financing. This is the next big contingency in your offer, okay, gang? You need to understand what program is the buyer going for and how much time do you need for that approval. We just hit on that, but you also need a pre-approval letter, okay? In our last session, we talked about financing and pre-qualification versus pre-approval. So if you were here, you caught that information. If you weren't, go back and look at that recording. But really great information that was shared by Sue Pagliarini at Atlantic Home Loans. And what's the difference between pre-qual and pre-approval? Many lenders are doing a full approval process with an underwriting review, and the buyer is just already approved subject only to appraisal. Make sure you're asking your lender or the buyer's lender what process they do. You need to submit that pre-approval letter with your offer, okay? Also understand what are the financing terms. Make sure you can speak to your buyer. If your buyer tells you in the middle of the transaction how excited they are that they just bought a new car, you want to put the brakes on and say, wait a minute, what just happened? We need to see how this affects your financing. You'd be amazed at how many buyers go out and buy new furniture for the house and put it on a credit card. They're all excited. They've got to furnish the house, and they put it all together. Oh, I just bought a new living room set. You need to have a sense of what will affect their qualifying and what will cause that disruption. So make sure that you do that. And whenever possible, when you're writing an offer, have the buyer speak with the lender or calculate the mortgage payment yourself. Okay, you should have the ability to estimate the buyer's mortgage payment. If they have a question at the time that you're writing this offer and they're wondering what their payment is, my question to you, do you have the ability to calculate? Do you have an amortization calculator that allows you to plug in the interest rate that they were looking at, the term, 30-year mortgage, if that's what it is, and ultimately the loan amount in order to tell them what their payment is, okay? You need to be able to do that. You may be taking an offer at 6 o'clock on a Saturday night and the lender is not available to run a quick number check. You should always be ready and capable of calculating that. If you're not sure how to do that, see me direct or reach out to your loan officer and ask them to show you how to do that. Sue Pag, who joined us, is always willing to help people learn how to break down those payments. So watch for things like that. Now, you need to be able to estimate that. You need to estimate what the taxes are for the house. Now there are some variables. Homeowners insurance, do they need private mortgage insurance because it's less than 20% down? Anything like that. So, be mindful that there are a lot of factors, but you want to be able to have a general idea or have the lifeline of the loan officer available so that, so that they can get in. Okay. So, so understand the timeline needed for the financing and also, for the, the closing thereafter. Talk to the lender up front. All right. That's just a general overview, and more so it's right when we're writing the offer. So, financing we talked about last week. I don't want to get back into that. Any questions on that when we're determining how to write the offer? Okay, great. What we also need to realize when it comes to closing date versus financing date, we need to understand what is the best time to schedule the closing based on that buyer's needs. Now, one of the factors that comes into play with that is something called prepaid interest. Prepaid interest in a mortgage is the interest that is paid for the remaining number of days in that calendar month. So what we've got to look at is when the buyer closes, their first mortgage payment is due the first of the following month after the closing. It's a minimum 30 days, but on the first of a month. So if you closed on the 31st of a month, minimum 30 days in the first month. So let's say we closed, September 30th. First mortgage payment is not due October 1st. It's actually due November 1st because it has to meet the 30-day minimum and the first of the month. Okay, so that's easy calculation. Let's say we closed on September 20th. Well, under that same formula, minimum 30 days, but on the first of a month, September 20th, the first mortgage payment is still November 1st. November 1st, any mortgage payment covers the month that just passed. It covers in arrears, it's not future like rent payment. So the November payment covers the month of October, but if you closed on September 20th, then you have 10 days in there that are not accounted for in the first mortgage payment paid in November. The bank collects that up front as prepaid interest in order to make sure that when that first mortgage payment comes due, it's still only covering that full month of October. So in that example, you've got 10 days worth of prepaid interest that factor into your buyer's closing costs. And in the beginning of a mortgage, it's primarily interest, right? I mean, you're paying very little principal up front in a mortgage payment. So you've got to be mindful that if you closed on the 5th of a month, then you have 25 days of prepaid interest. That's practically one extra mortgage payment. So you want to make sure that you're asking the lender, what is the best timing? Most cases, the lenders are factoring in 15 days of prepaid interest in their pre-approvals. Okay, so you're safe if you're in that mid-month mark. Okay, don't push every closing to the end of the month because the attorneys will be busy only one day a month. So make sure that you're spreading it out. I mean, make it work for everybody's date, but know that that date actually determines what the buyer's costs are. Now, mind you, if they close on September 5th, the beauty is they don't have a mortgage payment until November. So, it's like they get a free, month and 3/4 there, but they do have to pay for it up front. So some buyers have the ability to make mortgage payments, but not the savings on hand. Some buyers have the money on hand and don't worry about it because they can postpone the closing date. So it's all a matter of discussion to understand how that date affects your particular buyer. Make sense? Okay, so always watch that when you're determining the dates. All right, inspections. Next big thing, inspections. We have 10 business days to do any and all inspections. 10 business days to not only do the inspections, but to get the report, review the report, discuss the report with your client, present any requests to the seller, if there are any requests that the buyer is going to make, obtain the seller's response, and go into a contract or an agreement, a repair agreement, if there are any repairs that are agreed upon within the parties. 10 business days. Now, again, that's almost 2 weeks. but it's still a very short period of time if the inspectors are too busy and you can't get an inspection for over a week, okay? So be mindful of this. This is the one contingency in our agreement that is listed as time is of the essence, okay? And time is of the essence doesn't mean everybody hurry along because this is important. Time of the essence, I don't even like the title because it doesn't explain what it means. Time is of the essence means the date is a drop dead date. And once the date passes, then everybody is responsible for what's happened in that time frame. Meaning, if you haven't requested of the seller any repairs or you haven't requested an extension, then you don't get a chance to ask for anything. Time is of the essence means it's over. There's no ambiguity on that. Okay, so be very mindful when it comes to these inspections. Right now, the parties can extend all of these time frames. You can extend these time frames as part of the offer if you know up front that there's something that's going to be hindering those timelines. You know, it can be discussed. There are a couple of factors when you get to that point, and when we're handling those sections of the agreement, we'll discuss that in a future session, because you need to be mindful of what is the process by which you make a request and the process by which you go into an agreement with them, okay? But for now, what you're worried about is making sure that you have the right number of days in your offer, you know, in order to make sure that you can accomplish it. So if there's anything that needs to be discussed, timeline-wise, you know, now is the time to do that, okay? So when you get to the point of the repair request, you know, you're going to have different forms that come into play. So when you look at the timelines of that agreement, everybody, you have to, buyer has to request, seller has to respond, parties have to agree. Well, everything needs to be fully in writing, but if you're going to request it, you need to prepare the request in advance, and that's an actual request form, an extension request form. It's not a quick email sending, hey, I need more time. Okay, there's a formal process for that. But ultimately, when your buyer gets to the point, just projecting forward, when your buyer gets to the point that they have items, they've reviewed the inspection report, and they're concerned. Now, by the way, I mention this because you need to advise the buyer at this point in the offer stage, because you're advising them on the contract, aren't you? They need to know in advance. It's not just, hey, let's write up an offer, see what happens. The next step after an offer is reviewing of the sales agreement. If you're doing it in the form of a sales agreement, it allows you to review each contingency, and that's the beauty of doing it in the form of a sales agreement. But when it comes time to doing the inspection, you need to assure the buyer that once they've performed the inspection, if they find any issues that they did not expect, the seller prepares a disclosure form for a reason. It's so the buyer understands what they're buying. Technically, every sales agreement is subject to an as-is sale. I think it's funny when people add as-is to a sales agreement, because every sales agreement is as-is. It's in the language of the agreement, but it's subject to inspections. So the buyer's determining, based on inspection findings, are they comfortable with what the seller disclosed and what they found, or did they find things that the seller did not disclose or didn't know about? In most cases, giving the seller the benefit of the doubt. In many cases, they didn't know that an issue existed. So once an issue is found, we have a form called the repair request form. It's very important you understand that there are two forms in that process: the repair request form and the repair agreement. The repair agreement is an after-the-fact form. It's a form that all parties sign, identifying the items that are going to be, you know, addressed by the seller. The repair request form allows for the buyer to request the items that they want and for the parties to negotiate. Has anyone here ever used the repair request form? You can physically raise your hand if you have. Okay, all right. So the repair request form, here's the critical part about the repair request form. A few things, and these are forms, you write them down and go look at them later. Okay, don't wait till you need one to understand it. The repair request form, first and foremost, allows you to make the request for all the items that the buyer wants, okay, that the buyer wants the seller to address. It also allows for the seller to have more time to get information on those items that are being requested. So let's say the roof was found to be in need of replacement. Well, if you request on the 10th day for the seller to, your buyer does, I always talk in terms of your clients, if your buyer requests that the seller have the roof replaced prior to closing, you know that the seller will need to get a price from a roofer to find out what that looks like before they can even respond. So the repair request form allows you to add a date specific that allows the seller more time to get pricing. But it also protects the buyer in the contingency so that it states the buyer is making the request within the contingency, and while the seller does have more time to respond, this request meets the requirements of the contingency. So it's very important that you understand the use of that form. It also includes the language, the form, request form includes the language that should the parties not agree on the details, that the agreement is null and void, okay? The law says, according to Rhode Island law, with regard to inspections, it says that within those 10 business days, the buyer has to have done inspections, but they have to have informed the seller that the agreement is null and void within those 10 days if they choose not to purchase the property. So this repair request says, if seller doesn't agree, this agreement is null and void. It has the language that is critical to the law. Because if you send an email with requests on behalf of the buyer and everyone's discussing back and forth and the date passes and there was no language in there that said, if we don't agree to these terms, our agreement is null and void. If it's not in there, then the buyer's deposit could be in jeopardy if you don't come to terms. And they, and even further, not only their deposit, but other ramifications. So it's up to us as a buyer broker to understand what language protects that buyer, and that is that repair request form. Okay, I had a question come in. Michael had to head out. No problem. We'll catch you on the recording. I thought there was a question in the chat box. So watch that repair request form usage, and then watch the repair agreement document that allows for everyone to have the terms under which everybody's agreed. Any questions on those forms or that process? You can physically raise your hand if you need to, except those that are hiding out. So, all right, so closing costs. Another issue, many buyers today are rolling closing costs into their offer. So a closing cost concession, banks don't like the word credit, concession. Now, by the way, we have all of our language on our contract verbiage cheat sheet in the download manager. So watch for that whenever there's any question, okay? But any closing cost concession, what we need to realize when we're adding in a closing cost concession, we need to obtain the figure from the loan officer based on that buyer's costs. If you overestimate a closing cost concession, the buyer could lose money. So example, if you're putting together a sale at $300,000 and the buyer has the ability to have the lender pay 3% of the purchase price towards closing costs. Well, 3% is a lot of money, okay? 3% in this case is $9,000. So if you rolled in and said, seller to pay 3% of the purchase price, or wrote it out in numerical form of $9,000, okay, seller to pay at closing towards the closing costs, well, very rarely in that price point would they come in at $9,000. So you may find your closing costs to be more in the range of $5,000, sometimes $6,000. Well, if you wrote up, and in many cases we inflate the price in order to allow for that concession. So that 300 price, you write it up as 309 if the appraisal will allow for it with a $9,000 concession. Well, if the closing costs only come up to $6,000, the buyer loses that $3,000 because they've agreed to a price at 309 with a $9,000 credit. But the lender will only allow allowable costs to be covered in that concession. So if those costs, allowable costs, are only 6,000, then the buyer's still paying 309, but only gets a $6,000 benefit. So it's very important that whatever the amount is that you're rolling into any offer for a closing concession, that you ask the lender what they expect in that price point. And the reason I say ask the lender is because should the time come where the money is lost because it was overinflated, it's so much easier when the buyer says, what do you mean I can't get that difference? Well, you need to speak with your lender because they gave us that amount. It's so much easier to say that than to say, I'm sorry, I miscalculated and cost you $3,000. Okay? It's always better to put it on the professionals. That's their job, and that's why they're there. Make sense? Okay? So there are folks who say that they'll give the money back on the side or give a check back at the closing. What we need to understand is any agreement that is not on the closing documents is not allowed. So in that same example, if it was $3,000 overage, the seller can't give the buyer a check for $3,000. They can't just credit it back. And people say, oh, we'll do that on the side, or we'll do that under the table at the closing, or anything that says under the table or off the closing documents is illegal. It's loan fraud. Don't be part of loan fraud. Don't put together agreements that allow for these fancy concessions. Same thing when you get into repairs. You can't put together an agreement where the seller is going to give the buyer 20 grand after closing to go towards repairs. If it can't be on the closing documents, it is a reason for that, and it's because it's illegal. So if you ever find yourself in a situation like that where you have the parties agreeing something and you're trying to figure out how to package it, talk to us. Every scenario is unique, and there are ways to go about it. But ultimately, you need to know that anything that's outside of that context, is mortgage fraud. Okay. Title is another thing you're going to see with your offer process. Okay. Our standard offer form, as well as the sales agreement, states that it's subject to the seller providing clear marketable title. So the title has to be clear. It needs to be free of any liens. The mortgages, any mortgages the seller has, any liens they have on that title need to be released. Now that's the attorney's job, and that's done through the closing attorney, but you don't need to worry about it, but any contract should be subject to free and clear title. Now, there has been a question with what attorneys are involved in the closing. You need to understand that the closing attorney represents the lender. The lender chooses the closing attorney from the list of approved attorneys. Now, if your buyer has an attorney that happens to be on that list, that attorney can conduct the closing as well. But the attorney at the closing represents the lender. The buyer can have an attorney do their title search and assist them and represent them at the closing by attending the closing as well. But ultimately, the closing attorney is chosen by the lender. Okay, so it's important that we understand the distinction there. If a lender says to a buyer, oh, your attorney's not on our list, we can't use them, they can still use them for the title portion of that. It doesn't cost more. All of these costs are costs to the buyer. It's just a matter of who's actually doing the work. So whenever there's a question on that, speak it through with the loan officer as well. Make sense? Okay, great. Appliances and miscellaneous details. When you're writing an offer, it's very important that you spell out what would remain, even if it's listed in MLS. Very important. We assume things listed in MLS are going to stay. If stove, refrigerator, washer, dryer are all listed in MLS, be mindful. You can put appliances per MLS, but make sure you have a copy of that MLS sheet, because at some point it can change and you don't get an update with what's removed. But it should be, it's better practice. It should be written out that ultimately stove, refrigerator, washer, dryer to remain. Now, appliances and things like that are in as-is condition. We need to know that. And the buyer can look at them during an inspection, even though home inspectors don't really look at appliances, the buyer can at the time of the inspection. But in most cases, they're not buying new appliances, and they are being purchased in as-is condition as existing appliances. So anything that you're adding in there, if it's furniture, furnishings, anything like that, you know, the buyer needs to know that, you know, everything is in as-is condition. Okay, so don't assume their condition in any way. Okay, built-in items are going to remain. Anything that's attached or a fixture to the property will remain. There's a blur with some things, like window blinds stay, they're attached. Window, you know, louvered shutters, things like that, you know, would stay. Curtain rods would stay, they're attached, but the drapes that are hanging from the curtain rods are not considered fixtures. So if there are custom curtain rods or drapery rods, you need to identify whether or not the seller is taking those with them so that there's no mistake on that. You know, but if it's attached, it would remain. Built-in appliances will remain. Built-in ovens, dishwashers, and those are listed as standard in the sales agreement. It's just important to understand what is a fixture and what's not. A window air conditioner is not a fixture. Okay, central air conditioning, of course, is. But if there are individual air conditioning units that the seller says will stay, you need to list them as well. Okay, so anytime you have fixtures of that kind, you want to make sure that you list it there. Okay, so those are the types of things. Now we've got some different that we're going to deal with an offer, the main components of the offer. But there are contingencies that we're going to deal with as well, and I want to go through different contingencies that you're going to come across. Okay, now does anybody have any questions on any of those primary functions so far? I'm going to grab another sip of coffee. You all get there in
in an offer, if you want to have, if your buyer is negotiable on the closing date, you know, so you say, okay, so 5-6 weeks for the mortgage, but you know, the buyer could wait, you know, another month if the seller wants to wait. So how do you word that in the offer?
Great question. So ultimately you would put in a date that is ideal based on the situation. When you're writing the offer, if you're using a letter of intent, you can just put in a date. So let's say whatever that date is 45 or 60 days out. Let's say that closing date is October 30th. You could put in the date October 30th for a closing and put in parentheses flexible at seller's discretion, you know, just to identify, hey, here's where we'd like to close, but we're flexible. In a sales agreement version, you would put the closing date in there because it's only a line item that you can enter, and you'd go to additional provisions and you'd put in, you know, buyers willing to extend the closing at seller's discretion for an additional 30 days upon mutually executed extension between parties, something like that.
Okay.
Make sense? So you're kind of saying, here's what we're looking at. You don't just put in flexible, because then it's like, well, flexible, okay, let's close in 2 weeks then. You know, so you know, it's flexible with more time, not necessarily less time, because you have too much to accomplish. Make sense?
Okay, maybe that would be a good one to add to the cheat sheet, because I looked there and I couldn't see that on the cheat sheet.
All right, great. No, I appreciate the suggestion. Definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? All right, great. So I want to go into the sale of buyer's property contingency. All right, so this contingency is where the buyer has a home to sell and they want to buy the new home and they want to go into deposit on the new home. It's called the sale of buyer's property. It's known as the Hubbard. So you'll find that title as both. And it was formerly known as the kickout contingency. So the title of the form has evolved over time. So ultimately, in this contingency, the buyer has a home to sell but wants to secure a new home. Many buyers don't want to find the new home until their home is sold, but they also, in many cases, don't want to list their home until they know where they're going to. It's a real big catch-22. In the sale of buyer's property contingency, the seller goes into contract with your buyer, and it's subject to them selling their property. As an example, they find the house, they secure the house, you go into an agreement with that contingency. The buyer then places their home on the market for sale. In this contingency, it says that it's subject to the buyer closing on their property, and not only closing on their property, but securing a buyer for that property. Now, once the buyer secures a buyer for their property, they can seek removal of this contingency so that the seller's home comes off the market. But if you're seeking the removal of that contingency, it's also stating that you're no longer contingent on selling or closing your property. So you have to be really careful when you remove this contingency. Now, there are two ways you can remove this contingency. You can remove it where it's no longer contingent on the closing of your house, or you can remove it where it is now closed, subject to the closing of the property. Now, in that removal of Hubbard form, you would check the appropriate box to understand what that contingency is. The removal of the contingency form allows you to select either option. In most cases, the seller finds a buyer before the buyer finds a buyer for theirs. So the buyer's house now goes on the market and they're looking for a buyer, but the house that they're buying, the seller keeps it on the market. So both parties are seeking. The goal is that the buyer finds a buyer for their house before the seller finds a new buyer who wants to make an offer. In those instances where the seller finds another buyer first, the seller has to alert the buyer, has to give notice to your buyer that they've found another offer that they're willing to accept. Now, the sale of buyer's property contingency can be a 24-hour notice, a 48-hour notice, a 72-hour notice. I tend to go with 48 hours. 72 is a long time to be waiting for somebody to make a decision. But basically, in the 48-hour notice, the seller is saying to your buyer, I have another offer I'm willing to accept. I'm giving you 48 hours notice of that intent of me accepting that offer. And in 48 hours, you need to tell me if you're willing to remove the Hubbard contingency and buy the house without it being subject to the sale of your property. So the buyer has to decide in 48 hours if they're willing to take that risk. First of all, do they qualify for it? Secondly, is it something that they want to do, even if they did qualify? Many buyers don't want 2 mortgages. Why would anybody want to pay 2 mortgages? So this allows them 48 hours to make the decision of whether or not that they're willing to remove this contingency, okay? Now, no buyer in this contingency should be waiting to get that call to contact their lender to find out if they qualify to remove that contingency. They should be planning well in advance to find out if that's a possibility, because 48 hours is not a lot of time, especially if you get the call on Friday night at 7 p.m. that the seller has another offer on the table, and you cannot reach the lender until Monday morning. There is no way that that buyer can even respond. So the buyer, when I look at this clause, 48 hours, 24 hours, I like the idea of 2 hours, quite frankly, because the buyer will know within 2 hours if they're willing to remove this contingency. They'll really know within minutes if they've done the necessary legwork to determine up front, okay? So that contingency is critical if the buyer needs to sell their house first. Any questions on that? Okay. Short sale. When we don't have a lot of short sales right now, but you need to know that there may be some with the way the market continues to shift. In a short sale, it doesn't affect your buyer, but does affect sellers, and those could be the homes that your buyers are buying. And in a short sale, the seller owes more than what the current market value is. So the seller has to apply to their lender for permission to sell less than the market value. So what we need to understand is while in a short sale, we're still dealing with the seller of the property, the seller is dictated by what their lender will allow. I've seen short sales take as much as 120 days to get a short sale approved. At some point, my longest short sale was 13 months to get a short sale approved, but that was back when it all first started and the lenders were just getting a handle on it. But I've seen it 90 to 120 days because they really got the process down and got it streamlined. But if you have a situation where somebody does owe more than what the property's worth and they're doing it subject to a short sale, we need to go into it knowing that the seller cannot guarantee any time frame, that we're at the whim of their lender in approving that short sale. Make sense? Okay. So, and again, we don't have as many of those now, but it's a valid situation out there. So, another topic is multi-units, multifamily properties. Now, anything 5 or more units becomes commercial and the lending changes for that. So you need to make sure that you're looking at the proper lending for 5 units or more. But when you're addressing a property that is multi-units and a buyer, whether it's an investor, first-time buyer, owner-occupied, or even not first-time buyer, owner-occupied, make sure you're speaking with the lender to ensure that the lending is in proper order. They need to handle that detail of it. Our role as the realtor is to ensure that the details are covered. Some of the details that come into play with multiple units is lease agreements. Are there lease agreements? Are they month-to-month tenants or are there lease agreements? Are there security deposits? Okay. There is a form in Instanet that is the confirmation of rental terms, and that form is signed by the tenant as well as the landlord. Each individual tenant gets the form. It allows them to disclose, what am I paying for rent, and did I give a security deposit to the landlord? The tenant and the landlord both sign that. So if you're on the listing side of a multifamily, you should have those forms signed so that you have it as part of your package. But you should be seeking those when you have a buyer purchasing a property. There are too many times that a buyer goes in, they close on the property. The landlord said, I didn't take any security deposits, and the buyer comes in, closes on it, meets the tenants, and the tenants inform them of the security deposits that they gave the previous owner. And now it's a matter of, okay, well, who's correct here? If you didn't collect it from the seller, you may never collect it from the seller. So, the opportunity is during the transaction to get the documentation you need, okay? Also, depending on the structure and the layout of the property, so you may need to confirm in the seller's responsibility or the buyer's, because sometimes the buyer takes on the responsibility, and that is for the fire smoke detectors. What are the laws for that? Is it a 2-unit? Is it an owner-occupied 2-unit? Is it a 3-unit, 4-unit? Does it need just hardwired smokes? Does it need sprinkler systems? What does it need? We need to understand what are the requirements from the fire marshal for that property. If the buyer is asking the seller to bring it up to code, which is the most common, then you need to identify that in your offer, but you need to know that the seller needs to identify what is that requirement. What does that look like? What needs to be done? And generally, at the time of the offer, you can just clarify that who's going to take care of it, but don't allow your buyer to assume responsibility of it if they haven't looked into what that responsibility is and what needs to be done for that property. Okay, very important. The buyer could be thinking that they're putting battery operated smoke detectors in, and it could be hardwired. Some of the older houses, it's harder and harder to wire into the ceilings and walls if it's the older plaster. So you need to be very careful that you didn't set them up for an unexpected failure because they thought they could just put in some battery operated smoke detectors. Okay, it's up to us to identify that. Also at the closing, the seller will prorate rent. If you closed in the middle of the month, the seller probably collected rent in the beginning of that month for the full month. At the closing attorney should prorate the rent so that your buyer gets the rest of the remaining portion of the month as a credit because they now own the property. Okay? Questions on that?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
What you were talking about, up to code on the fire and smoke detectors and stuff like that. Are there regular home inspections in commercial like there are for residential? And then also I was curious if there wasn't any inspections when the building was being appraised, is that something that would come up then?
Great. No, thanks, Kelly. Great question. So an appraiser is not a home inspector. Okay. So we do not know, we don't want to expect that. Now, what we need to realize, some appraisers have to go in and look at it more detailed if it's like an FHA financing, what have you, almost feels like a home inspection. But generally speaking, they're not qualified to do that. You need to be licensed to do home inspections. Now, that said, there are different inspectors for different properties. So yes, you can definitely do any and all inspections, whether it's a residential or a commercial property.
Okay.
Yep. So make sure that it's contingent on that if that's a concern.
Now, so if it just didn't come to surface, when would it trigger to prevent the closing if the fire inspections if that wasn't up to date, if what they had wasn't up to date or up to code?
No, that's great. So in order to convey a property, the seller has to have the fire marshal come in to conduct an inspection to ensure that the system is up to date. Okay. So that's part of the conveyance of a property. So ultimately they will do an inspection by the fire marshal, and that will come up. Unfortunately, that always comes up within the week or two just before the closing, because that inspection is held off. It's any certificate for an inspection like that is only good for 120 days. So the seller will hold off in case something happens and falls through. But ultimately, it's a seller's responsibility to confirm that it meets the standard, but the contract has to identify who is responsible for it if it doesn't meet the standards. And in Rhode Island, you cannot convey it unless it passes those tests and you have a certificate showing that it is passed.
Okay, so that's the stop point. That's where.
That's a stop point. Yep, absolutely. Okay. But if it says the buyer will conduct any improvements to the fire system, now it's a matter of, is the buyer willing to do it before closing? Will the fire marshal allow it to happen after closing? There have been times where we do video inspections right now because of the pandemic and things like that. There are different factors that come into play, but that is the point at which you learn whether or not it's going to pass in order to convey.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Great. So from multifamilies, we go to condominiums. Okay, if you're making an offer on a condominium, you need to make sure that your buyer understands that they have certain rights within the condominium world. And that is, first and foremost, they're going to have the ability to review the rules and regulations as well as the financials of the condominium association. According to the sales agreement, it says that the buyer will have 10 days to review all of that documentation, 10 days from the time they receive the documents. So it's important, especially if you're on the seller's side of things, that you give those documents very soon in the process, because the buyer has 10 days from the date they get the documents to review them. So always document receipt of those forms. But on the buyer side, you need to make sure that your buyer has the ability to review those agreements. Now, the buyer is not going to be able to change the condo documents. It truly is a review to see if you're comfortable with it. If the buyer is comfortable with the complex and the rules and regs that surround it. But they also need to understand that there are financials involved, and they want to ensure that the condominium association is solvent. If they don't have any savings, they don't have any money in the bank, how are they going to pay their bills? Your buyer is going to come in, they're going to pay a condo fee monthly, and money has to be there. So that's why the buyer has the right to take a look at those financials to ensure that they're comfortable with the solvency of the association. Now, the association itself, or the condominium management, if you will have all of that documentation, and will also identify whether or not the buyer has to put money up. Sometimes a buyer has to put a couple of months worth in reserve in order to ensure that there's a working, they call it a working capital deposit. That's all in the condo docs as to what will be required. So the buyer may need to put up a couple of months, and it just allows that there's always money in the working capital deposit. So seek that information because you need to fill that in on the sales agreement once you agree on terms. And again, any proration would take place at the closing as well of money that the seller paid in advance or hasn't yet paid would be prorated with the buyer. Okay. So the last thing on condominiums is you need to understand whether or not there are any assessments. An assessment in a condominium complex would be, an example would be if there was work being done to the outside of the complex. Let's say there were outdoor decks on the units, and there was work being done to paint those, scrape and paint or repair any of the decking around the complex. The association would pay for those repairs, but they would assess all of the owners a pro rata share of that cost. So, you know, if they spent $100,000 on repairs in that complex, they're going to assess that to all owners in an equal pro rata share, and in many cases will be paid over time. So if there are any repairs that are coming up for the complex or any repairs that were just done, the buyer needs to seek that information in the negotiations to understand, because they're going to be paying on that assessment it will convey. The seller doesn't take that expense with them. It gets carried on to the new owner. Okay, so make sure you ask questions like that. Okay. Manufactured homes, you know, they were once called trailers back in the day when they still had axles and wheels. You know, they graduated to that of mobile homes. They graduated since then of manufactured homes. It's all the formality of the title. You know, and some of them are actual modular homes, whether they're on leased land or individually owned land. It's important to understand, especially when it's in a park. If you're in a mobile home park, you need to ensure that the buyer has the time to apply to the park owner because they need to get approved to enter the park. The land is leased land. It's rented from the park owner. So even though the buyer may qualify to purchase the home, they may not qualify for the application to live in the park. So it's very important as part of the process, and it states it right in the agreement, the terms upon which the manufacturing homes and the park and the application and what have you. But you know, it's very important that they make application. Just because, again, just because they can get the financing doesn't mean they can rent in that park. So check that out in advance. The park owner has the final say when it comes to anybody coming in. Some parks allow pets, others do not. It's important to understand. Many parks have assessments. In most cases, the buyer is just going to pay the personal property on the home and then rent the land and maybe sewer and water charges. It's very important to get a full breakdown from the listing agent, or if you're the listing agent, provide a full breakdown of all of the expenses that are involved. Okay, so each park is very different. Some have different fees. It's important to break that down. And also understand that with a manufactured housing, it is not real estate. So you are not getting a specific mortgage or a general mortgage. You are getting personal property financing. So it's a specific lender. One lender that I know that I've referred in the past is Sterling Financial, and there are others as well. But it's very important that you look at that and make sure that you understand what financing is out there that's available. Okay, many buyers will qualify for a mortgage, but then they'll start looking at manufactured housing and that financing won't apply. All right. So, you know, so those are some of the contingencies. Let's look at some of the scenarios that we deal with. And the first and foremost, getting back to what I mentioned earlier, what is multiple offers? Okay, multiple offers are so predominant right now. I've seen 10, 15, 25 offers. I've seen over 30 offers on some properties. It is insane. And it is very hard to navigate as a listing agent, but especially as a buyer's agent. It's very important that you express to a buyer, if they are competing with other offers, that they need to truly be comfortable with the offer they present. And we can call it a walkaway number. They need to be truly comfortable with presenting their walkaway number such that the seller, when they make a decision, should the seller decide on another offer, that the buyer does not hesitate for 1 second in realizing that their offer was all that they'd be willing to pay. Okay, so you need to be able to talk through it. You're going to educate them, like we just discussed, with all the pricing, the terms, the financing, the any contingencies. All of those details are going to come into play. But at the end of the day, the buyer needs to make the decision. And should for some reason the seller accept another offer, they need to feel good knowing the fact that they gave it their all. A seller can only counter offer to one buyer if they're countering and didn't accept any of the offers that are on the table. They can only choose one. Now, don't get me wrong. I've seen agents counter to multiple buyers. Don't do that. If a seller makes a counter offer to more than one buyer, what happens when they all accept it? It's very difficult. So the seller should choose the offer that they feel best about and make the counter offer to them. So when you present the offer and the seller makes a counter offer or accepts your offer, then your buyer needs to feel really good that they gave it their all and they got it. But they also need to be comfortable knowing that if they didn't get it, that they gave it their best. How many times had I had a buyer say when I called them and say the seller went with another offer, and they said, well, why didn't they counter? I would have come up. It's very important for you as the professional to advise them on what that walkaway number is, for them to actually truly understand that they may not have a second shot at this. And the seller does not have to counter just because they made an offer. So they need to be prepared. And that's anytime you're competing with multiple offers, you need to understand that. There is a form called multiple offer form, and that multiple offer form will protect you in explaining to the buyer how it works. When you're dealing with multiple offers, the buyer truly needs to know that the seller can only work with one offer and can only choose one offer. So even if the listing agent didn't give you a highest and best form, they call it a highest and best, it's really called a multiple offer form. Even if the listing agent didn't give you the multiple offer form, you can still have your buyer sign it just without a date, because it gives a deadline. If a listing agent presents the form, it says we need all offers by such and such a date. As a safe rule of thumb, you can have your buyer sign it, just that it explains to them that really this is their one shot at it. And it allows you to properly explain it to your own buyer, even if the listing agent didn't share that. So check out that form if you're not familiar with it, because it helps explain. On the listing side, use it because it explains to the buyers what the process is. There are too many times that a buyer or a listing agent rather will navigate multiple offers, and when somebody loses out on it, they're all upset. The buyers are upset. Co-broke buyers are upset because their co-broke did not explain to them the process properly. The co-broke expected a counteroffer. So the multiple offer form on the listing side allows you to bypass a co-broke who doesn't understand the process or who didn't listen, or both, and have their buyer sign the form so that they're better educated on the process. It saves you and your reputation as a listing agent because it explains that process. Okay? But you need to find a way to explain to your buyer how to determine a walkaway number when it comes to multiple offers. Again, even if they don't ask for highest and best, the day you hear from a listing agent that we have multiple offers on the property, you need to immediately go into consultation with your buyer and explain it. And one of the ways that I explain to a buyer how to come up with their highest and best offer, or what I call that walkaway number, is this. Okay, so everyone's familiar with the Saturday newspaper, right? In the Saturday newspaper, we have the home section. And in that home section, there's a list of properties that have recently sold. It shows the property that's sold, it shows the seller information, the buyer information, it shows the price that it sold for. Okay, most people read that section if they're looking at the Saturday paper. Just curious, if nothing else. Homeowners who are not on the market are curious just what others have sold for in their area. Okay, well, most people look at that. So we use that as an example, and I'll say to a buyer, Mr. Buyer, you read the Saturday paper, the home section? Are you familiar with the section where they list all of the properties that have sold recently and what they sold for? Yeah, okay. Well, this house is going to be listed in that section in the next maybe couple months, maybe 3 months. But basically, after it closes, it'll be listed as a recent sale, just like all of the ones that you're reading now. So if you were unfortunately not the one to get an offer accepted, you will see that home listed in the paper in a few months. And when you see that home listed and what it sold for, you need to look at that price of what it sold for, and you need to be confident in saying, you know what, at that price they can have it, because I'm not willing to pay that. But if you look at that price and you say, oh my God, I would have paid that, today is the day to pay that. That is how you determine your walkaway number. What is the price you're willing to pay, such that anything beyond that, you'd be willing to look at that paper and say, they can have it, even if it's $100. Today's the day to offer what that final number is, so that if you have to walk away, that you paid all that you would for that property. Okay? So that's one way to help them. We all learn best and we make decisions best by having we put ourselves in the shoes of the person. Okay, so ultimately, when we look at that, help them put themselves in the shoes of the person who lost out on that offer. Okay, so I hope that helps with that. Offer form versus sales agreement form. You've got to determine what format is going to work best. With the multiple offer situation, the best bet is to do a sales agreement version for an offer, but know that it's an actual contract. If the seller signs it, it's a contract. So you need to make sure that every contingency is written out properly, all the details are in place, and everything is true, because once it's signed, it's signed. Kelly, I just saw your question. Sorry. Would you or could you ever upload the multiple listing form in MLS? Help me out with that question.
I meant, would you ever upload the multiple offer form in MLS under that listing? Because then it would just let people know while it's still in there that there's already multiple, it's that situation, just kind of letting the buyer's agents know for their clients.
You could add it to the seller's disclosure package, or add it as an upload in there, because it sets a predetermined date. But the other thing you could do is just, you want to identify in the showing instructions that a multiple offer situation exists. So, so you can say multiple offers, deadline such and such a date, see multi-offer form in attachments.
Okay.
Yep, but yeah, that would make it easier, and you're referring them to that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. So you need to understand, all of the terms of the sales agreement, the offer form. There is more of a chance of the seller signing a sales agreement that's presented than not having a sales agreement to sign. Okay, there's always time that goes by. So if your offer presents it on a letter of intent, your buyer presents it on a letter of intent or an offer form, well, once you agree on terms, then you have to get to a sales agreement. So the time between that negotiation and the sales agreement, anything can happen. So the fastest you can get signatures on any agreement, the better off you're going to be. Okay, eliminate any wait time whatsoever. We have a package in the downloads for you, an offer package. It allows for the offer form, our letter of intent. Now, our letter of intent is very similar to the one that's in Instanet, okay, from RIAR. I'm on the forms committee for the state, And our letter of intent is very similar to that one. So you'll see, very, very close similarities. So whether you use ours or the RIAR form, you're in good shape. Ours is a little bit specific to some of the language we use. RIAR has to be more generic to appeal to a wider audience. So, when in doubt, the best bet is to use our in-house form that's available. But our offer package allows for that offer form. It allows for the agency disclosure, because that's the last point in time you need to get that agency or representation disclosure signed. It also allows you a couple of tools that would be efficient for you, and one of them is the negotiation notes. And that is just a document that allows you to track the conversations that take place between you and the other parties, so that there's no question. If you're verbally discussing or texting or what have you to negotiate, it's hard to remember when an appliance was added in or an appliance was taken out, or specific details changed. It's just a simple tool that allows you, here was the original offer, these were the details. The counter offer came in at this, the date and time that it came in, it changed this detail, buyer went back and responded. Just a simple way of helping you keep your thoughts organized, so look for that. We also have an offer cover letter that allows you to identify an introduction for the offer, and the cover letter allows for just an explanation to the listing agent. Hey, listen, this offer is made under the premise that there are no other offers on the table, or this is made knowing there are offers on the table. It just identifies that. If there's any compensation that needs to be discussed as part of the offer, it can be in there. And we also have an offer checklist that just makes sure that you remember all of the things you need in order to present an offer. Deposit check, copy of the offer, copy of the agency disclosure, all of the forms that come into play with that. There's a checklist there for you to have that. Okay? So, those are the types of things that you could be using, in keeping yourself organized as you're working with buyers. Okay? So that's a big overview of the offer process. What questions do you have that we didn't hit on? Anyone? No one. Wow, I covered it all? God, I'm good. All right. So a lot of details. I'm sure you see those details on a regular basis. If you haven't written enough offers yet, you will see them. We record these so that you can go back and review. For those who weren't able to join us, it's right after the holiday weekend, so I figured we'd have some folks that would rely on the recording, especially today. But I appreciate you guys tuning in. So, ultimately, those are the details. Look forward to next week and, continuing our series, but I appreciate you guys being here. Any last thoughts? So quiet. All right, guys. All right, again, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
you're welcome. Bye-bye.